Please be seated.
Mr. Weber, you may proceed.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Your Honors. For over 3.5 years, the world watched as General Mladić subjected Sarajevo's civilian population to a ruthless campaign of shelling and sniping. Throughout this campaign, no one was spared from the impact of the SRK's bullets and shells, since everyone knew either they or someone they loved could be hit at any time. The point of this campaign was to cause terror, to instill the immense fear of not knowing when or how the next shell or bullet would tragically change lives forever. This trial chamber heard from witnesses who told you what it was like to survive within the SRK's encirclement. Witness after witness described the terror caused by the shelling and sniping. These witnesses came from all walks of life, and many of them possessed significant military experience. They all had the opportunity to observe and experience the daily conditions. Whether it was the UNMOs, other internationals, journalists, police investigators, or the residents of Sarajevo themselves, these witnesses all described to you the prolonged and violent VRS campaign directed against the civilian population. One of those witnesses was Suleiman Srnčalo. As Mr. Traldi told you about earlier, Mr. Srnčalo and his family were forcibly expelled from Pale in July 1992 in order to, quote, save their heads, unquote. They left only to find themselves trapped in Sarajevo for the next 3 years. Over those years, he and his family endured what so many others had to go through in the city. They lived without electricity and running water. To keep warm, they started burning wood. And when that became hard to find, they burned floorboards, doors, and even shoes. When humanitarian aid was cut off, they were forced to eat boiled grass and leaves. The difficulty of all this was compounded by the sight of blood and corpses in the street from the constant shelling and sniping. Mr. Srnčalo himself often wished for rain, just to wash away the blood from these streets. Like so many others, he lived with the constant fear that when he left the house, he would not return alive, or that those he left behind would not be alive when he returned. When shells fell like hailstones, he explained, quote, "We thought that nobody would survive," unquote. If they would have had an opportunity to leave, he told you they would have left. But at no time during the siege did he or his family have that opportunity. Only a few months before the war ended, his wife went to the Markali market on 28 August 1995 after she heard a rumor that powdered milk might be available. After she failed to return, Mr. Srnčalo learned about what we are now going to see. At this time, could Ms. Stewart please play a brief portion of Exhibit P446? Once Mr. Cerncello heard about this shelling, he followed his wife's route to the market. He searched for her in the bloody streets we just saw. When he couldn't find her, he then went to the hospital and checked its list of wounded. Then he found his wife. She was in the morgue, lying beside 6 other deceased women. After all this, and after years of surviving in Sarajevo, he went home to have a conversation that, for so many living in the city, was all too familiar. He told his children what happened to their mother. They then buried her under the cover of darkness with the other victims of the shelling because daylight funerals were too dangerous. Pastor Cerncello was one of 43 people killed by the SRK shell that was fired from the area of Trebovic on 28 August 1995. The Markali 2 shelling was one of the last in an all too long list of shellings and snipings of civilians and civilian areas in Sarajevo. The chamber has received many other videos showing the aftermath of shellings and snipings in the city, including P136, P864, P7551, and P7566. While these videos are not going to be played during these submissions, they also show the havoc and carnage that was caused by the SRK's bullets and shells. In our final trial brief, the prosecution has laid out the shelling and sniping campaign from its inception in April 1992 through its intensification and continuation under General Mladić between May 1992 and November 1995. Today, and for portions tomorrow, the prosecution's final remarks concerning the Sarajevo Terror JCE will first focus on General Mladić's responsibility for the charged crimes of terror, unlawful attacks, and murder. These submissions will then address the SRK's shelling and sniping campaign. And lastly, I will address particular defense submissions from its brief. Most of the defense's arguments in relation to the Sarajevo JCE are addressed in paragraphs 1034 to 1057 of the prosecution's final trial brief. General Mladić is responsible for the campaign because he is the one who was in charge of it and the one who directed the forces who implemented it. From May 1992 to late 1995, Mladić terrorized the civilian population of Sarajevo with a campaign of shelling and sniping that was implemented by SRK forces under his command and control. And it was Mladić who was in command of this campaign, ratcheting the terror up and down as it suited his own aims and those of the Bosnian Serb leadership. In this way, he used Sarajevo as a pressure point where Bosnian Serbs could exert or reduce force in an effort to achieve their overall objectives. These overall objectives, as you have heard, included the cementing of the ethnic separation they were either seeking or had already accomplished in large parts of Bosnia. From the moment of his arrival in Sarajevo in May 1992, Mladić eagerly participated in the terror JCE through his direct involvement in attacks on the civilian population. At that time, he established his absolute authority and unquestioned control over the SRK. He then continued his hands-on approach to the SRK throughout the campaign and deeply involved himself in the things they did. From the beginning until the end, Mladić knew exactly what he wanted from his subordinates, and he approved of the ones who implemented his orders. This is evident from the fact that key implementers and fellow JCE members, Mladić and Milosevic, were rewarded by him for the brutal manner in which they implemented the campaign of terror on the ground. Mladić's authority was also well known throughout the SRK's chain of command. This is apparent from the regular way in which he made it absolutely clear to his subordinates that he was the one who was in charge of what happened in Sarajevo. For example, in D-75, a 24 May 1992 intercepted conversation, Mladić reinforced his authority to one of his subordinates in Mladić. He made it perfectly clear that, quote, I am in charge of giving orders to fire, unquote. The message Mladić was conveying was simple. When the SRK fired its guns, Mladić fired those guns. Mladić's authority throughout the campaign was manifestly evident to internationals as well. Based on his personal experiences with both SRK commanders Mladić and Milosevic, General Fraser concluded they both were following Mladić's orders, and they had almost no latitude in making their own decisions, but that in some cases, they had a little bit of flexibility on maybe some sniping. Similar experiences were conveyed by other witnesses, including Tucker, Abdelrazik, Harland, Rose, Smith, Wilson, and Thomas, among many others. References to these comments can be found in paragraph 714 of the prosecution's brief. There are many other examples of General Mladić's active and engaged command over his SRK troops. In addition to his frequent orders that he gave related to all facets of SRK operations, he was also often present on the Sarajevo front, visiting SRK positions. One of these visits was during an interview in 1992, when he proudly toured the dominant positions he held above Sarajevo. Ms. Stewart will now play you a portion of that interview, Exhibit P76.
He gives us a rare chance to accompany him to frontline artillery positions where the UN observers are conspicuous by their absence. High up on the windswept hills, the 100mm guns are dug deep into the rocks directly overlooking Sarajevo, an overwhelming position of strength which is obviously to the general's satisfaction. As he says, he holds the city in his palm, and many of the buildings in the haze below bear testimony to that power.
As we have just seen, Mladić and his forces controlled the dominant positions around Sarajevo. And he clearly knew that he held the city's population captive and could do what he wanted with them from the very beginning. This fact was reflected in many of Mladić's early statements in May 1992. He confidently stated, quote, I have blocked Sarajevo. The city is trapped. There is no way out, unquote. During another conversation in May, he told a subordinate to inform his men that, quote, entire Sarajevo is blocked. There's nothing they can do. They can only breathe and birds can fly around Sarajevo, unquote. These are intercepted conversations P327 and P323. With the city at his mercy, General Mladić became entrenched in the activities of the SRK during the months of May and June 1992. His campaign against the civilians of Sarajevo began shortly after he received his appointment as commander of the VRS main staff, and promised during the 16th Assembly session that he would ratchet up the ongoing attacks on the city. Only 2 days after the 16th Assembly session, on 14 May 1992, his forces launched a large-scale artillery attack, with many of the shells falling on residential areas in the eastern parts of the city. This massive bombardment even affected Biljana Plavšić, who referred to the shelling in P2733 as a horror and asked, quote, do they really have to shell civilian targets, unquote? In the weeks that followed, Mladić repeatedly threatened that he would destroy the city if his demands were not met. He promised that he would retaliate against the town and told his subordinates, quote, make sure your soldiers are aware that Sarajevo is going to shake. Sarajevo will shake. More shells will fall on per second than in the entire war so far, unquote. That's Exhibit P327. General Mladić made good on his threats and promises.
Mr. Weber, if I could just briefly interrupt you. Mr. Mladić should refrain from any facial expression, gestures, whatever, and is invited to focus on what happens here in the courtroom rather than on the public gallery. This is a small warning. I leave it to that. No, you are not supposed to speak. If you want to respond, you can tell counsel, and then you have an opportunity to.
No loud speaking.
And no speaking allowed. Mr. Mladić, I said you should refrain from gestures. The first thing you're doing now is to repeat them.
Turn around.
And perhaps you turn in such a way that you can focus on what happens in this courtroom. Mr. Weber, please proceed. You are again speaking, Mr. Mladić. This is the last warning. So refrain from gestures, from facial expressions, or from speaking aloud. There's nothing when listening to the final argument that urges you to consult with counsel. You can do it in the next break if there's any need to do that. Please proceed, Mr. Weber.
General Mladić made good on his threats and his promises. This was vividly demonstrated during scheduled incident G1. On the evening of 28 May, Mladić decided to exercise his authority and ordered the SRK to indiscriminately bombard civilian areas throughout Sarajevo. These orders can be heard by everyone here in the courtroom on the recording admitted as Exhibit P105, where General Mladić calmly, repeatedly, and deliberately instructs his subordinates to fire on civilian neighborhoods, including Basharsha, and also Velesici and Pofalici, because there aren't many Serbian inhabitants there. Ms. Stewart will now play a portion of this conversation from P105.
Mladić, don't do that. Why do you want to go for Pofalici? Mirko, well, because we only fired one volley at it. Mladić, fire at Velesici. Velesici. Mirko, Velesici. Mladić, Velesici, yes. Mirko, understood, sir. Mladić, fire at Velesici and at Pofalici. There aren't many Serbian inhabitants there. Mirko, yes. Mladić, then fire around that Dobrovoljačka street. Around there. Humska street, up there. Mirko, around Humska, Mladić, and Jure Đaković Street up there. Mirko understood, sir. Mladić, is that clear? Mirko understood, sir. Mladić, but go on artillery surveillance so they can't sleep, so we drive them out of their minds. Mirko understood, sir.
As further detailed in the prosecution brief at paragraphs 925 to 930, Mladić took over direct command of the SRK operations during this bombardment. And the neighborhoods and locations General Mladić ordered to be shelled were in fact shelled. The attacks were ferocious, there were casualties across the city, and damage was extensive. General Wilson explained what he saw that night. He stated, quote, "It appeared the whole city was being engaged, not just particular areas, but there was an emphasis of fire in the old city," unquote. And Wilson continued, quote, it was a really horrendous experience for the inhabitants of Sarajevo on that particular night," unquote. Wilson saw exactly what General Mladić had ordered, and the accused accomplished his stated purpose, to terrorize the people of the city, or in his words, to drive them out of their minds. The defense feebly argues in paragraphs 1906 to 1910 of its brief that the SRK only engaged military targets in the city during the G1 bombardment. The defense relies on the testimony of victim Fadila Tarchin, which they argue somehow shows there were military targets in Shirakacha. The defense significantly distorts her evidence. In fact, Tarchin said that there were only unarmed guards in her neighborhood, and that on one or two occasions she saw a few reserve policemen pass through. She testified she never saw ABIH forces, checkpoints, or artillery weapons in Shirakacha at the time, and there were never any outgoing attacks from there. Also, the defense ignores the witness evidence on page 5 of P1596 and transcript pages 4995 and 5048 to 5053. Only a week after G1, Mladić's forces launched another series of large-scale bombardments in early June as part of scheduled incident G2. During these bombardments, recurring waves of SRK artillery shells were fired into the city for days. Civilians across the city were killed and wounded, and civilian neighborhoods experienced widespread destruction, as described in paragraphs 933 to 937 of the prosecution's brief. In the city throughout this attack, journalist Arno van Linden said that the early June shelling of Sarajevo was the heaviest he experienced in his time there. Positioned with his cameraman on top of the state hospital in the center of town, van Linden reported on the attacks, and he described the wild scattered shelling, with shells raining down over the city with no particular target. There was no military purpose, he reported, but to bring terror to the lives of everyone living in the city. That's at transcript page 1322. The defense argues in paragraph 1920 of its brief that the SRK was not responsible for the G2 attacks because, quote, they were under strict orders that fire had to be restricted, unquote. For support, they rely on VRS Directive 1, which General Mladić issued on 6 June 1992, suggesting somehow that this directive contains an order to restrict fire. But there is no order in Directive 1. To the contrary, General Mladić ordered the SRK in this directive to use offensive actions to improve its positions in and around the Sarajevo area. But even apart from the actual language of Directive 1, the defense's claim that the SRK was not responsible for the G2 bombardments is contradicted by the 4 videos admitted as P72 to P75, which show what it actually looked like in the city during the G2 bombardments. Ms. Stewart will now play a portion of one of those videos, Exhibit P75.
Suddenly on Sunday night, the whole city becoming the target. No district spared. All shaking as every 10 seconds the rockets, shells and mortars land. The fire so heavy, so incessant, that the deadly streams of light crisscross each other.